We are now going to be doing Chapter 8, which is on torts. And tort is a word that comes from the French, and it means a wrong. And when somebody does something wrong to you, we call them the tortfeasor. So sometimes you will hear me refer to tortfeasor. That's the person who's done the wrong. One of the things that you want to remember is that we have two systems of law in this country. We have our civil system and we also have our criminal system. So when someone does something harmful to you, they can be liable in both systems. They can be subject to a court case both in the civil system and in the criminal system. So they could have criminal liability and they could also have tort liability. And we actually use some different names in the two different systems of law, so sometimes that becomes a little bit confusing. But just keep in mind that we have these two systems. What we're going to talk about today are three types of torts. First of all, we have intentional torts, and that is when someone actually intends to do a wrong to you. Or they actually intend the action. Maybe they mean it to be a prank, or they think it's funny, but they definitely intended to do it. That is going to be something we call an intentional tort. We then have negligence. Negligence is just when someone doesn't use the level of care that they should in doing something, and they can be liable in those situations. And finally, we have strict liability. And strict liability means that no matter how careful you were, you are still going to be liable for any harm that results. Strict liability just comes up in a few extremely dangerous situations. For example, if you're using fireworks, or if you keep exotic animals like lions and tigers, things like that. Okay, so intentional torts, we have three kinds. We have torts that are against persons, so they've done something to you personally. We have torts that are against property. They've somehow invaded your property. And then finally, we have torts that are against your economic interest. And we will discuss each one of these in details, but I want you to get an overview of what we are doing. I also want you to remember that tort law is state law. We do not have any federal tort law. It's done by each individual state. This means that the only way that you can get into federal court if you have a tort case is through diversity of citizenship, which we've talked about earlier. So keep that in mind. Tort law is state law. It also means that we have 50 different versions of each tort law, so things might differ from one state to another depending on what they have enacted. Tort liability has been an area that was always getting bigger. We had lots of cases where people were suing other people and companies for torts. And in the last 20 years, that has really begun to decrease. We've had a reduction of cases in this area, and it's mainly been due to some laws that were enacted in the area of tort reform. That's what we called them. And it was that we felt that tort liability was sort of getting out of control. People were being held liable for all kinds of things, and the amount of money at stake was huge. So that has really come down since the 1990s. All right, so what we're going to do today is talk about the three different types of intentional torts. The first one that we want to talk about is assault. An assault is when someone makes a threat of imminent physical harm against you. They haven't actually touched you yet. They just are threatening to physically hurt you in some way. So you have to have a fear of immediate bodily contact. Another example would be here. And it doesn't have to be particularly harmful, but it is a fear of offensive bodily contact. So you are afraid she is going to slap you, something like that. That would be assault. One of the things that is required in assault is it needs to be immediate. If someone threatens, let's say they call you and they say, I am going to come over and hit you next week, that is not assault because it is not immediate. If it's going to be something that happens in the future, that would not be assault. It has to be some sort of immediate threat. We also look at the person and we ask, was it reasonable that they were in fear of this offensive bodily contact? If someone happens to be very sensitive and it really, a reasonable person wouldn't have been scared in that situation, then that's not going to be assault. So it has to be a reasonable person would feel fearful. In the picture that you are seeing, we have the young man who's cowering behind the books. We also have the guy with the clenched fist. The clenched fist is enough to suggest that there's going to be some sort of physical contact. Now, one other thing that you might want to realize about both assault and battery is that offensive bodily contact is anything that is offensive. So it doesn't necessarily have to be violent. If someone comes up and kisses you, you don't know them, you did not want them to kiss you, that can be offensive bodily contact. So it doesn't necessarily have to be violent, it just has to be offensive in some way. Now our next picture is battery, and the reason this is battery and not assault is because he is actually touching him. So we have the actual physical contact. Now we have battery. And battery does have to be intentional. If you accidentally bump into someone, that is not battery because that was not intended. That was just an accident. So we don't call that battery. Now, one of the questions that I often get is, what about when we hear about someone who's been sexually assaulted? Isn't that battery, not assault? Why are those words mixed up? So I want you to remember what we talked about. We have the two systems. We have a criminal system and we have a civil system. And in the criminal system, assault can refer to actual bodily contact. But in our civil system, we have just the offensive bodily contact is battery, and if there's a threat of it, then that is assault. So it is different. Okay, one other thing you'll want to know about battery is it can occur when someone uses an object to hit you. If someone takes a football, throws it across the quad and it hits you, that is battery. Even though they didn't touch you personally, they threw an object that touched you, or they hit you with an object, that is still battery. We have a few defenses that people can bring up to both assault and battery. The first one is consent. So if you have consented to being touched or offensively hit in any way, that is a perfectly good defense. And we usually see this brought up in the form of team sports. When you play team sports, you are consenting to being hit by other players on the team. So you cannot sue them for battery in that situation. You also can assert self-defense, just like you could in the criminal system. Self-defense, and if you are defending someone else, let's say you are defending a child or a friend or even just someone that you see, if you are defending them from battery, you can use force up to the level of force that they are using. So if they have threatened someone with deadly force, let's say they are threatening to shoot someone, you may shoot them in response. That is the level of defense that you can have in that situation. So if they are merely threatening to hit someone with their fist, then you probably should do no more than that. You don't want to pull out a gun in that situation. Now you're bringing in deadly force where maybe there would not have been deadly force used against you or the other person. The last defense that we have is defense of property. So you can also defend your property, but you can only use reasonable force in this situation and rarely deadly force. You really probably cannot use deadly force ever in defense of property. Now remember, if someone would come into your home and threaten you with a gun, you are defending your property, but you're also defending yourself in that situation. So you could respond to them with a gun. But if you are just defending your property and nothing else, then you really can only use reasonable force. And we have had this situation happen in Columbus, Ohio. We had a man who, he was sort of an odd character, and he lived in a home, and he kind of by himself. And kids used to like to ding-dong ditch his house. They would go up and ring his doorbell and run, and it was happening one time, and I guess he was fed up because he pulled out his rifle and he shot this young girl and killed her. And he is now in prison for that because he could not defend his property with deadly force.